Welcome everyone to Choosing Courage Over Audacity. And Tahil is an interfaith activist based in Los Angeles and born to a Hindu father and a Sikh mother. And Tahil's became involved in interfaith literacy and social justice and has been doing this for the past 7 years. And I love in his bio, he mentions the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, which I actually, there's All Saints in Pasadena, which is a fantastic social justice based church here in the area. So I love that you're with that. And then also with Interfaith Youth Core, which is a fantastic group, lots of work in with students and who has been a good ally and partner of ours in the past as well. So Tahil, it's great to have you here. And with that, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you all so much for choosing to listen to me today. I know you could have been doing other things, but I have a lot of gratitude towards being in this space. So I am just going to quickly start this presentation and certainly hope that you all are able to see it. So yes, my name is Tahil Sharma. I come from a dual religious background. As a Hindu and a Sikh, I am practicing both religions, which we can come to those questions later. But I'm here to talk about an interesting predicament that we've had to address, especially after the Trump administration. And that is the ability for communities of faith and moral conscience to be able to connect with and engage with governance while at the same time being the tradition of a separation of religion and government. This process, this experience is one that I've taken some time to write about and to talk about in different spaces, but today I have the privilege of being able to have that conversation with you all. So what centers us today on this conversation is the First Amendment, that Congress shall pass no laws in the establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof, which means we all have the right as citizens, as residents in the United States, to practice and believe what we feel are in our realm of convictions. So we are free to practice religion or to stay away from religion in any way that it might infringe on us as well. And this is where we already start having a pretty muddy conversation, because I come from what is considered the interfaith movement. It's a global movement. It's something that is bustling and usually inclusive. But these are terms that we often stay away from, like interfaith, like interspiritual, like interreligious, because of some key second parts to each of those terms. The inter part, the ability to engage diversity and be inclusive, is not the problem. And the ability to engage between different communities is not the problem. Oftentimes it's the idea of involving faith, religion, and spirituality that can oftentimes be very exclusive. So the assumptions that come between communities of faith doing interfaith work and secular communities, those of you who are atheist, agnostic, secular humanists, we come to this idea that the adherence of religion itself is inherently bad, that the interfaith movement remains only a space of interaction between faith communities, and that religious and secular communities can't come together to work on issues, let alone have dialogue. There is some truth to these assumptions, unfortunately, because of the nature of distrust, of misinformation and ignorance, and the inability for people to look towards each other as allies in the process of working for justice. What happens, though, is we do get caught up in, the giant brushstrokes of generalization of religious people towards secular people and vice versa. And what that does is it creates disarray and stops us from actually being able to engage each other in meaningful ways. So one of the things that we have to think about is language. When we're talking about the interfaith movement, we can also call it by other names, so we can acknowledge this idea that we can work with each other. But that's just a starting point. One of the terms that I like to use is pluralism, basically a dynamic engagement between various communities. It's a good replacement, but it's not the only thing we need to replace in this system of understanding work across diversity. The inherent nature of interfaith movements has to be seen as something that is very secular in nature. And it's because we want communities, traditions, and worldviews to become more inclusive and to be equally represented in these spaces. So I can't actually do interfaith work if I'm just calling on religious, spiritual, and indigenous people to show up into a space and talk about the issues that matter. It also means I have to invite folks that are atheists, that are agnostic, and that are secular humanist to be able to be a part of that conversation. If we're going to achieve genuine spaces for exchange and solidarity, we have to improve our approach towards bias, towards disagreement, towards misunderstanding, and towards any of those things that actually keep us divided. To deconstruct these processes impacts the approach we take in working on themes of justice, sustainability, accountability, and peace. So how do we change those perspectives? Well, what we have to first do is actually look at the root of what often is the challenge of how secular communities may look at religion. I again can talk from, brushstroke generalizations. I'm speaking to you all from my perspective and what I've been able to observe. Religion is not inherently toxic, but it is a conductor for patterns and behaviors and institutions that can become toxic and violent. We can't ignore the role that religion has played in power and privilege and politics and violence in human history. But there is a coexisting nature to who is perpetrating the violence by using it through the justification of religion. It's not every single person that is religious or spiritual that does that inherently. It actually is people who already have the power and privilege to misguide and to sway people to be able to justify the narratives or the frameworks of being oppressive. Religion cannot be defined as just ardent beliefs. They need to be considered as a part of an intersectional identity. I may come to you all in this space as a deeply religious person, but that's only one part of me. I am also an Indian American. I am also bisexual. I am also someone who is looking to live a good life with his family. I'm also looking to make sure that others have the rights and privileges that I do in being able to thrive in this society. This is not something I can only have for myself. I want it for other people too. Religious and secular communities share common struggles in representation, in inclusion, and accountability. I was just speaking on a podcast yesterday about one of the inherent issues of the interfaith movement in the US and among many groups on the ground at the grassroots level is that they actually perpetuate a level of white supremacy that is not actually something that they believe or practice. Interfaith groups don't push for white supremacy. But the problem is when the center of power, when the locus of power remains in the hands of the white, upper class, cisgender, straight, elder populations of people, especially who are men, you're not actually committing yourself for a transformational movement that is truly inclusive, that is truly diverse, and that is actually doing meaningful, impactful work on the ground. You are just reshaping and resurfacing this idea of, oh, these Christian leaders were in Christian spaces, now they lead interfaith spaces. You can't do that. That's not how this works. And this is actually a struggle, unfortunately, that you not only see in the interfaith movement, but that you see in secular movements as well. There usually is a specific type of person that leads atheist or secular humanist spaces that does not speak to the narrative of folks that might adhere to the same views or convictions, but that are not represented in places of leadership and power. And one of the biggest changes that we need to have in that process, in that realization, is that religious, spiritual, indigenous, and secular people share concerns, challenges, and successes in the work for a better world. if we keep looking at each other as, you know, obstacles to be able to achieve bigger things, we're actually falling into a trap of white supremacy, into the cycle of oppression that keeps us separated, that doesn't look at each other as allies or accomplices for justice. That divisive rhetoric is what keeps us separated. But we are mutual stakeholders in how we want to rebuild the world to become a better, more peaceful, just, and sustainable society. If we don't look to each other as stakeholders, we're just holding ourselves back. That's kind of the intent of many groups that are very right-wing in nature and that use religion as a justification to make sure that divisions prosper, rather than acknowledging that our diversity is what makes us rich, and that rich engagement means we can achieve something bigger. A part of this conversation of how we address, you know, diversity and inclusion is the idea that the United States is becoming a changing environment when it comes to religion and spirituality. And we can see that with newer generations of people who are looking at religion and their institutions as being inherently problematic or inherently toxic. Some of that has truth. There's no doubt about that. And we can see the dissent that is taking place because of it by this chart that's created by the Public Religion Research Institute. They did some studies through their 2016 American Values Atlas in 2016 of seeing where they are able to find people's worldviews. And if you look at what skews as elder, you will find that there is a significantly higher percentage of people that happen to be Christian, white people, and particularly mainland and evangelical Protestant. But as you see the shift to ages 18 to 29 and 30 to 49, there's a much larger percentage of people that call themselves unaffiliated. That's a big deal. That's a very important thing to note in this space of how the landscape of how we view religion and spirituality keeps changing based on newer generations that are born. In the United States, 24% of people identify as unaffiliated. And that's a big deal because even though a majority of folks do still identify as Christian in some fashion, it actually doesn't dismiss the fact that as one large section of society, that the highest percentage and growing percentage happens to be folks that are becoming unaffiliated. Of those percentages, atheists and agnostic folks make up for about a quarter of that percentage. About 6 in 10 people remain secular, so they don't necessarily say that there is a strict belief in no God or a belief in God, but that there's somewhere in between. Or that people who do still identify as religious but don't identify with a specific institution. That is attacking the very face and idea of what the interfaith movement should be acknowledging, that there are folks at a spectrum of unaffiliation and disaffiliation, that they're still not being engaged in interfaith spaces. And one of the reasons why is because this changing landscape doesn't really properly address the idea of where groups and movements on the ground that are either grassroots or at the larger level among leaders are actually reaching out to people correctly. So in the history of the interfaith movement, at least in the United States, one of the biggest events to happen was the first Parliament of the World's Religions that took place at the Chicago World's Fair on September 11th, 1893. You had leaders from all over the world gathering in Chicago, being able to talk about why people from different religious communities need to come together and get along. We didn't see anything really at that level, but historically speaking, there have been strands of interfaith practices or coexistence or engagement that we can find in different regions around the world. But particularly in the US, we also see this approach to understanding religious freedom, which is where in the year 1900, we see the development of the International Association of Religious Freedom. Go forward several decades, and you will find that in the 70s and 80s, you have the establishment of international or global organizations like the World Conference of Religions for Peace or the Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions taking shape. And then you go a couple decades later and you find organizations that are purely grassroots, unlike Religions for Peace that works with faith leaders, or the Parliament of the World's Religions that's more of a gathering space, to actually focus on grassroots movements. Then you shift a couple of years and you have the Interfaith Youth Core, which has been a partner of the Secular Student Alliance, who actually are now in the last 10, 15 years looking at a more dynamic way in acknowledging people's worldviews and convictions and their shared commitment to improving relations, to working for justice. And in 2021, we still are struggling with the ability to get people involved in this work. And scattered in between all of these major movements and organizations are dozens, if not hundreds, of ecumenical and local interfaith groups that have developed. I'm involved with some of them on the ground. I've been involved with almost all of these organizations that we've mentioned in this scale in some way, shape, or form. And it begs the question, when we're talking about all of this interfaith work, all of this interfaith engagement, how does this help impact the way that we work with governance, with politics, with ongoing issues that seem to become more polarizing every day without eroding the separation between religion and government? We have to remember that separation of church and state is not preventing us from working together. Separation of church and state is reminding us that no one religion rules over a community as diverse as a country like the United States. Freedom of religion and from religion is protected by the First Amendment, and no individual or institution can infringe on this right because of the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, which means all the laws that cover me are all the laws that cover you. We are protected in our personal convictions and beliefs, and that we cannot infringe on other people just as they cannot infringe on us. Those protections do not and should not deter people from being civically engaged, especially across the spectrum of difference. What I think often people forget is that just because the First Amendment protects us, and just because there are things like tax exempt status for, faith secular communities, for nonprofit organizations, it doesn't mean we can't speak up against an injustice that a government or a political party is enacting or trying to enact. It doesn't mean that we don't speak out about injustices that are consistently happening on a daily basis. It actually means our ability to work in a shared space, and so we have a commitment for working for the rights of others, becomes a mandate, that we just don't do it for our own communities, that we also do it for others. When I started doing interfaith work, I was inspired by the Oak Creek, Wisconsin Sikh Gurdwara or temple that was attacked in 2012 by a white supremacist. That attack, 8 years later, continues to be in my mind in some way, shape, or form, because I remember thinking about the disappointment, the anger, the confusion of my identities, to the ability to actually think that I genuinely have a freedom of practice of my faith? But what it didn't actually make me think about until later in time was this event is a reminder of how much injustice minority communities have to endure. The Sikh community has not experienced this for the first time. It experienced a lot of this following the September 11th attacks in 2001, but have historically experienced this kind of discrimination since the arrival of the first Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims from South Asia in the 1880s. And it's a part of the shared nature, the shared experience of discrimination and injustice and oppression that should build a network of solidarity between other communities. What I experienced as a Sikh brown man should remind me of how I need to engage with my Black sister or brother that is enduring police brutality, that is able to help me connect with my atheist colleague who is not able to feel represented in an interfaith space or in the halls of Congress or elected offices. It does not help me, step back to consider how all of us need to be dedicated to making sure we don't get COVID-19, that we're social distancing, that we have to solve issues like climate change, that we need to have more fiscal responsibility that is more ethical and moral towards the uplifting of communities that are caught in a crisis of homelessness and poverty. We have to really understand that there is a more dynamic nature to how we need to engage each other, and that it's minuscule things that, because we experience things differently and our communities get attacked differently, that we don't see eye to eye with other communities. And my invitation is for you to reframe that. And the reason why I say that is because we've had quite a transition from the last president to the current one. And the last president, who I am choosing not to name them for who they are because they don't deserve it, is someone who has really tested the boundaries of the separation of church and state in his approach and in his administration's approach of retaining religious liberty and freedom. A number of different things, like attacking the Johnson Amendment, which, prevented faith communities from being more politically active by endorsing candidates, was sharply under attack, where we saw a sharp increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, where we saw sharp increases on using religious justifications to prevent women from the bodily autonomy that they deserve by needing services for contraceptions or for abortion. A lot of those things were under attack under the Trump administration. And those things continue to linger going into the Biden administration, unfortunately, because we do have a Supreme Court that is heavily conservative leaning. We do have faith communities or large corporations or organizations that are faith-based that are still looking to attack the genuine inclusive nature of the interfaith movement working towards justice. And that continues to be something that is on the agenda for the Biden administration, something that helps us protect not just how faith communities engage in all of this, but that we're protecting the sacred rights that belong to every individual in the United States. Working with making sure that people don't get COVID-19, but rather the vaccine, and making sure that that rollout is as successful as possible. Working towards environmental sustainability and climate change by shifting the approach to how we can better engage in practices that are helping the planet. Addressing racism and the oppressive systems that they create. That we continue to see flourishing because there are no significant reforms in mass incarceration or police accountability or economic rollout, and the repercussions that we're seeing with the current downturn and how it impacts homelessness, and how in the grand scheme of things, we're just looking to make sure that everyone has their constitutional and civil rights by having a more accountable governing system, whether at the local or regional level or the state or federal level. All of these things, in my opinion and in my perspective, are deeply moral and religious things that we need to strive for. But I cannot push these things as a way that Hinduism should be at the top or that Sikhism should be at the top, because these are things that we're striving for that encompass all of us, which are secular in nature. But I am moved as a religious person to strive for these things, which means we actually might share a better approach in trying to help fix the world or the shitty situation that we're in. Sorry. So we have to really think about what we want pluralism to look like in 2021 while retaining a separation of church and state. First, we have to approach responsible solidarity. In times of sorrow, joy, and curiosity, it's important to dedicate yourself to learning and understanding communities and their nuances that are different than your own. You do this with the intention of supporting them as you share common concerns and a willingness to engage with them in the work for justice, virtual and in person when circumstances permit. So when my community was attacked in 2012, the first question was not how do we help the Sikh community? The first question was, what is the Sikh community? No one knew who got attacked. The white supremacist that attacked them was actually trying to attack the Muslim community at a mosque, but got confused in the process in his own ignorance. We're not intending to change the target of who should be attacked in the United States. We're removing the idea that anyone should be attacked, that a community cannot flourish without other communities being able to support them in some way. A responsible solidarity means you go out of your way to learn about those communities, even if you don't have a reason to do so. You don't need to go join them to celebrate something or to go join them because they are facing a calamity. You go support them and learn about them and engage with them because they are a part of your community already. And I know there might be some pushback in your mind because you want them to do the same. I'm totally there with you. They do need to do the same. Sometimes you may need to start the conversation. Sometimes they will. Sometimes you may need to invite them to things to better engage or have conversations. Sometimes they will. And sometimes you need to talk about issues that are not just impacting you, but impact them in the long and short term. And they will do the same for you. And this continues to be a process of how we can continue to hold each other accountable. Because this is where we do get to learn and be curious and to really see where we do have some common ground in the approach that we have as living or coexisting, but also as working for each other's betterment. The second thing that we have to look at is pluralism in the public domain. Whether you engage in this work through demonstrations on the streets or through digital media platforms, you play an instrumental role as facilitators who prioritize facts, empirical evidence, and who raise the voices of marginalized and oppressed groups. The end goal is mutual accountability and abundance. When we're talking about things like COVID-19, when we're talking about things like climate change, when we are talking things like racism, we get caught in this major cycle of misinformation and fake news that is often perpetuated in spaces where there is a lot of criticism towards other communities, but also in spaces where racism, bigotry, xenophobia, and other hurtful sentiments prosper. And unfortunately, faith communities get caught in this too. Secular communities get caught in this too. So when we are dedicated to facts, reason, logic, and empirical evidence, that should be the norm that is set by all of us across the board. There is no hesitation from that. But oftentimes you need to take a better approach, a more contextual approach of how you present those facts, how you present that empirical evidence. Because oftentimes in digital spaces especially, you can't bring facts to a conversation on emotions and vice versa. It is a difficult approach in how people have fear, they have resentment, they have concerns, they have misconceptions about things that are taking place because they don't see everything in front of them. They are desensitized. We as moderators and facilitators need to do a better job in making sure that people understand why these things are so important. If we want people to be vaccinated, we're not trying to lie to them. We're not trying to fill them with conspiracies. We're trying to tell them it's for the betterment of your protection and the protection of the people around you. It's not as easy as saying that because many communities don't have a larger genuine trust towards authorities of either a public health nature or a governing nature. So they often turn to their faith leaders or their community leaders to look for that, that safety or that understanding. And that's where they become empowered and they become the folks that actually can help lead this conversation more productively. The last thing that is going to help you in being able to engage in 2021 in a more productive way without eroding church and state separation is you. You might not already know this, but you are a pretty awesome person. I'm not trying to be gushy in any way. I'm not trying to be, you know, avoidant of the fact that you're meeting me for the first time. You may have misconceptions about me. I may have some misconceptions about you. But when we're trying to aim for the shared nature of trying to improve the world, from my deeply religious perspective, I have a responsibility for you. I have a responsibility to make sure you're uplifted and equalized in the world with me. That if we are going to take care of creation together, that it can't just be about me and my community. It has to be about you and your communities too. That was probably the biggest message that I got from the 2012 attack against the Sikh temple. It was the fact that historically, I acknowledged that there were so many attacks going on against numerous communities. But an attack on my community reminded me that I need to do a better job of showing up when other communities get attacked, when other communities are struggling, when other communities are being targeted, because they are a part of my community, which is a larger community than what I can really name, because that is how I fit in this creation and what I feel is my purpose as a person of faith. It doesn't run as at odds with someone who believes different things from me. It's not supposed to, because we still have common values. We still believe in sustenance. We still believe in livelihood. We still believe in stability and safety. Those are things we're all going to share in the grand scheme of things. And if we're going to retain this idea of being able to hold people in power accountable for that process, for that ultimate intent of creating a better world, we need each other more than ever before. So I invite you to make sure that you understand your role in this movement. You can be the person on the front lines. You can be the person behind the scenes. You can be the person that actually can make a difference. Think about the communities in your area that are struggling. Think about the people in your area that might be different from you that you should learn about. Think about the people who actually can make you, can join your coalition being able to fight for what's right. Because the more people we can get involved, the better chance we have at making sure that we can achieve something better. So with that in mind, I kind of just turn it over to you all. I know I've, blabbered quite a bit, and I want to be able to speak more deeply and with more intent towards what you all have to ask me. I might have been a bit everywhere in what I had to say, which I apologize for, but I just want to open the space for any insight that you have to bring me, because I'm learning too. This is my process just as much as it might be yours. And I value the opportunity to be able to speak in this space. If you have any questions that you want to ask me today, you of course can, but I'm leaving my email, my website, and my Twitter and Instagram account if you want to engage me there for any deeper questions or longer conversations that you might have. Kevin, turn it back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so, yes, and so we wanted to, if you have questions, please go ahead and type those in the Q&A part so that we can get those to Tahil so he can answer those. And I think the first thing, and I think coming on, for the Secular Student Alliance and larger secular community, clearly the people that we are working with and really are part of community for, atheists, agnostics, humanists, free thinkers, skeptics. That really, to use a religious term, the soul of who we work with. We're stealing that one back. It's a good one. So I'm curious, how do you answer for the non-religious, the atheists who have really grown up and there has been genuine hurt and pain from religion and religious people? What is the sort of like, okay, now I'm supposed to do what and start working in an interfaith group?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think I kind of put the blame on the perpetrator, because that is what you do when injustice happens. Faith communities continue to struggle with this idea of including people in good conscience into the work that they're doing. That just because they are atheist, skeptical, agnostic, that they have no room to be able to engage. Most especially when in the dynamics of a family, in the dynamics of a parish or a religious community or sanctuary, these people continue to face pain and hurt. What is the expectation of people except to be as hesitant and as continuously skeptical from those spaces? And it makes me think about the approach that religious people need to take in calming the hell down about what people believe and what they practice. It means reminding them to engage with people that are different because they are a part of the fabric, which I've already mentioned before. But it also means we have to acknowledge the pain that we've given people by our beliefs, by our convictions, by our history, by our extension of how people take religious interpretation and come up with their own narratives and views. If religious communities are not going to make space for people who leave, not with the intent to convert them back, but with the intent to trust is built again. People still don't want to, acknowledge the fact that people leave faith communities and spiritual communities because they've directly attacked them in some way, shape, or form. They are not acknowledging the urgency of the convictions that they hold outside of what is religious and secular, and they're losing relevance because of it. And they should. They honestly should, because they don't have a space where they are not willing to address issues at the core of what is supposed to be a part of their moral framework too. If they don't want to talk about racism, if they don't want to talk about climate change, I kind of hope they don't exist anymore, because that is not how, religion is supposed to, exist and be relevant in the 21st century. But it's an ongoing conversation. And I think interfaith communities do have, by their secular nature, their inclusive nature, an opportunity to build better bridges with folks that might have been hurt by religious communities, to be able to have deeper conversations, healing conversations that help, deal with the trauma of what might have happened. And of course, that can only be complemented with, whatever mental health support that the person needs, that cannot come from interfaith spaces. They need to be done in a complementary way.
Thank you for that. There's a bit of an ongoing theme in some of the questions, and I think what you just addressed, and then also for there's, I think, once you take out sort of your conservative religion, in the United States, I think it's largely the Christian conservative part. But once you take that sort of out, more and more religious people are doing interfaith work that's inclusive of religions, but less so still of secular atheist, agnostic sort of work. So I think there's a bit of a hesitancy for some people on, so if we are trying to go into those spaces, then, why are religious people going to listen to us? And then if we are, how do we make it so our message is best going to be heard and we're going to be invited to participate efficiently and effectively?
Yeah, and I think this has everything to do with the parameters or the approach of how you begin this work. Oftentimes, interfaith spaces start with saying, oh, how do we as religious people share values? And then they talk about how do we then do the work on the ground. The problem with taking that first step is that it acknowledges that there is a privilege of the religious communities to focus on their values solely before engaging in the work. When the urgency of the work that motivates each of us should actually be the priority, so that you can better understand later that, oh, I've engaged in diversity without needing to acknowledge it, and now realize that this nuance is much deeper than I was giving it credit before. And when it comes to, this engagement across secular communities particularly, I think it very much needs to start from a place of, we have a common issue. How do we address it? You have resources and we have resources. How can we better use them to actually fix this problem? I turn to communities like Atheists United, who have been doing food pantries and helping to feed people who are in need for the past several months throughout the pandemic, which has been phenomenal work. There have also been faith communities that have been doing the same thing. And I'm quite surprised that they haven't come together in a significant way to do something more sustainable and to keep that momentum going and growing. And it trips me out because a lot of that comes from the distrust between communities towards each other. We're looking at the need right now, not looking at the difference of why the need is important to us. And if we keep faltering ourselves, if we keep falling flat on our face because we're not willing to actually just engage in the work, we're going to keep having this problem. So the invitation, honestly, is, twofold. One is the responsibility of secular people within their communities, within their chapters or organizations, to come together and talk about, hey, why don't we reach out to them if we're working on this project? They may offer us something that we don't know or that we may not have considered. And the second part is falls on me as a religious person and on religious communities to ask the exact same questions, to think about those same perspectives that don't usually get brought up. What are secular communities doing that we're doing wrong, that we don't understand? How can we better approach it? Maybe we should talk to them and see where we can take this conversation. We have to embrace this idea that, like, it's not just about who we need to impact that needs to be diverse, it's who needs to lead and help, create the bridges that needs to be diverse as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you ended with that. One of the comments was talking about, even within secular communities, we need to address our own internal structures and embrace more diversity within the secular community. Mm-hmm. And I think it's and as a white man, it's easier for me to say this, but it's easier in our society currently, just for generally white men and older white men to be able to be openly secular. You have less to risk, and I'm using clearly generalizations here. Right. You have less to risk. There's less social pressure. Those things we know. And American Atheists did a great study and looking at younger people and how dramatically there's much more risk, much more depression, much more rejection, much more harassment for younger people. And when you get into LGBTQ people and people of color and just in youth, but also, and they're about to release their secular report looking at people of color. And I think we, are clear in the assumptions we can make from the American society of what that means. Right. So it's, we're sort of all in this. We were talking a little bit earlier, and one of the things that we were, in a lot of SSA chapters, there actually are religious students who come and are active members because they want to have these discussions that they can't have in their religious communities. So I love that that our students can be, one, they love to have those conversations. So if they get to argue, friendlily debate, they love to do that. But I think it's also telling that it's not safe in a lot of religious communities to have those conversations about doubt and those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, not especially in the US, and you brought up white supremacy and racism and misogyny and those things. It's also not okay in a lot of those communities to talk about the religious link to racism, LGBTQ rights, misogyny, women's reproductive health, the environment, and how God gave us the earth to use it how we want, and to be able to COVID-19 and anti-vaxxers and all of these sorts of things. And I think for a lot of atheists and non-religious people, having to go in and go, hey, let's talk about separation of church and state, and all these other issues are in our realm, is daunting.
Right.
So I want to end that in a question, but I'm not sure how to do that.
No, I kind of have a response to, I think, that.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I think, how do you address something that's daunting, right? You can't address it as the giant beast that it is. So stop looking at it as the giant beast that it is. It's actually just a school of fish of smaller problems. Not that they're saying they're less significant, but smaller in terms of the size and urgency to other things that we need to address one by one in different ways. If you don't address the nuance of each of those issues and how each of us can play a role to mitigate its impact or to actually, make it more meaningful, we're not going to dissipate the problem. The problem is going to stay there, and it's going to actually grow in some ways because things continue to be urgent. The pandemic is not over. Climate change is certainly not over. It's getting worse. There are things that we need to acknowledge that, certain religious communities, we know we're just going to hit a dead end with them. So it's hard to start those conversations with them. There are many people who are already on the fence who are just not sure, or people that are already in agreement that there needs to be a better approach about this, that are our starting points to be able to address this in a significant way. And speaking as a Hindu, probably one of the best ways that I can probably engage in this work for justice is by speaking out and dismantling the caste system. I am an anti-caste Hindu because that oppressive system and the impacts on gender and sexuality and the environment that has is unacceptable. And if I don't speak up as a Hindu, as someone that comes from a higher caste, to actually destroy something that I know is oppressing people, then I'm not actually walking the talk. I'm just bullshitting. That's just the reality of what we need to do. It is not supposed to be comforting to be able to talk about this stuff. But what it is supposed to do is remind us that we're actually living into our traditions deeper by acknowledging the problems and trying to fix them.
Yeah, and definitely. And I think there are opportunities for non-religious people to be engaged in the discussions going on with interfaith work and within religious communities. And that doesn't mean everyone should be doing it. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy for people to do. But I think it's, coming from the LGBT community and just with everything that was happening with marriage equality and trying to take away rights, a lot of the national organizations in the LGBT community go, if we don't start making some inroads to friendly people, this road is going to be long and difficult, and we're not going to get anywhere. And so the LGBT community many years ago said, we're diving into this. I'm of personal belief that it's really swung, and and sometimes not willing to call out some communities going, hey, no, that's a little too far. Where are you again? Yeah. So I think that's work. And I think when we just come down to the basic issue of freedom of and from religion. Mm-hmm. And again, if we just want to work on that, there's still is a lot of communities with interfaith work and a lot of religious communities who are there and really benefit by the strong preservation of the separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's you know, I get caught up in a really weird situation because I get considered like a firebrand or a rock star in trying to engage with communities that are secular, when I have to keep reminding faith leaders and communities that, like, this is literally the bare minimum of how interfaith work is supposed to happen, right? Because if we're trying to, really build a bridge between folks who are different so that they can actually, clear the air about what people believe, what they do, how they do it, and how we can do things together. You can't do that from a distance. That's so absurd to me, that we have to continue living into this reality of, oh, atheists believe all of these ABCD things, but you haven't met one in your entire life, so you're just basing it off of telephone information. Like, no, engage with them. That's the bloody point. We have to take more intentional steps in making that happen. But the apprehension does come from, these walls we build between ourselves. Basically, it's like, oh, if I interact with this person, they're going to believe this, they're going to do this, they're going to say this to me, so why should I bother? Rather than saying, oh, maybe I should just go find out.
And we've had some interesting things happen on campuses over the last couple of years. So one where conservative religious students, and the increase in sort of harassment and animus towards our students has definitely increased sort of the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And I think that's obvious what that has. At the same time, like at Baylor University, so Baptist private college in Waco, Texas, where they won't recognize our student organizations. That's been there for, I think this is year 13 now, but they won't recognize the Hindu organization. They won't recognize the Muslim organization. And again, those groups, our groups, got together and went and petitioned the student affairs and the student government and said, hey, we're here. Like, we're not going anywhere. And, so they said, how about, let us have some space. Let us be able to book, rooms. Let us, just basic things that any student organization would be able to do. So again, that it didn't happen, but they got a lot closer than they have in the past. But again, it's that working together and recognize, especially in the U.S., the non-Christian, religions oftentimes are going to be our allies, because they're the ones that are feeling the Christian nationalism. They're the ones that are feeling the, when separation of church and state doesn't go in your favor. And I think there's many of that is very aligned with what happens with how a lot of atheist people feel in their sort of everyday with the government and religion and news and all the things that they say.
Yeah. And that came with a lot of the work that I noticed that I was called upon to do, not because I was specifically asked that I need to take part, but when I went into a space to see that, oh, secular students on campus at the University of Laverne don't have a space or a club recognition that they need to have, I stepped in and I said, okay, what do you need from me? How can I help? Let's make this happen. So not only did we form a secular student alliance, but we also formed a different philosophy club where people could go in, they could share their grievances, they could host events on campus. They had access to the interfaith chaplain on campus, who ended up being their advisor, but without impeding on them and saying, oh, you can only talk about these things. You cannot speak for other communities, because that's not our job. Our job is to figure out what their needs are so that we can support them accordingly.
No, that's great. And we're just about time. So, and I think that's a perfect sort of a place to end. So I really appreciate your time here today. And thank you for sharing with us. We often don't do a lot of invitations to religious people to come in and speak. And so I think, again, part of that is helping build our own coalitions and making those stronger. And again, we have friends within the religious community, and that doesn't mean I have to believe your religion, and that doesn't mean that I'm gonna convert you to an atheist.
Right.
However, we have common things that we all can work towards in making our society a better place, making it better for you, making it better for me, and making it better for people down the road.
Mm-hmm. And it always comes down to making sure that if we're actually going to be better practitioners at being more ethical people, it also doesn't mean we should hesitate from calling each other's BS out. If you're doing something wrong, or if I'm doing something wrong, or our communities are doing something wrong, we should talk about it and we should fix it.
Sure. And if we have a relationship, it allows us to be able to better call that out, and hopefully then be a little bit more productive in what the learning moment that takes place and the end result. So yeah, I definitely agree. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Really, truly appreciate you spending a little bit of your Saturday with us. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for the variety of questions and comments that we got as well. So I wish everyone the best of the rest of the weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.